David's heart pounded against his ribs as he pulled up to the abandoned warehouse. The street was eerily quiet, except for the occasional rustling of wind against broken glass. Then, he saw her. A tall, pale woman standing unnaturally still under the dim streetlight. She moved slowly, gliding into the back seat without making a sound. David cleared his throat. "Ooh, you're going to..." She nodded, cutting him off. Her expression was blank, eyes vacant, unblinking as he drove. Something gnawed at him. The streetlights flickered as he passed, and the air in the car felt heavier, colder. He glanced at the rearview mirror, but she wasn't there. His breath hitched. He gripped the wheel tighter, eyes darting to the back seat. She was there. She had to be there. But her reflection was gone. A sinking feeling clawed at his chest. He swallowed hard, forcing a casual tone. "So, what brings you out here?" Silence. Then his phone's GPS glitched, rerouting them toward an old cemetery. A sharp chill seeped into his skin. She finally spoke. Her voice was a whisper, cold and distant. "I never made it home." David's stomach dropped. He slammed the brakes and whipped around. The back seat was empty. His hands trembled as he scanned the seat. There, pressed into the leather, was a single wet footprint. The next day, curiosity gnawed at him. He searched the address she had given. His blood ran cold. It was the home of a woman who had disappeared on that same date, 5 years ago. Her body was never found. Story 2. The hotel room that watches you lean aside, exhausted from hours of driving. The hotel wasn't much. A dimly lit hallway, flickering bulbs, and an eerie dampness that clung to the walls. The moment she stepped inside her room, an unsettling odor hit her. Mold, mildew, and something else. Something metallic. She ignored it, tossing her bags on the bed. As she brushed her teeth, her eyes landed on the large vent above her bed. It seemed off. Something about the darkness inside made her shiver. A strange feeling crept up her spine. Slowly, cautiously, she stepped onto the bed and peered into the vent. Her breath hitched. Two human eyes blinked back at her. A scream ripped from her throat. She scrambled back, heart hammering as she grabbed her things and bolted to the lobby. The manager's reaction made her blood freeze. He wasn't surprised. The police arrived. What they found made Lena sick. A hidden crawl space ran behind the walls. Someone had been living there, watching guests through the vents. Even worse, the authorities uncovered tiny cameras, hidden in every room. She had checked in for one night. The person behind the walls had been expecting her to stay much longer. Story 3. The cemetery phone call. The night was cold and still, but Mark and his friends were fearless. Armed with flashlights, they laughed as they dared each other to touch the oldest tombstones. Then, his phone buzzed. An unknown number. Mark frowned, answering hesitantly. Silence. Then, a deep, rattling breath. Mark's throat tightened. "Hello," a whisper slithered through the speaker. "Look behind you." Every hair on his body stood on end. His pulse thundered in his ears as he turned. A woman in a black dress stood just a few feet away. She was staring at him, unmoving, expressionless. His breath caught. "Guys, look!" His friends turned. The woman was gone. The next morning, Mark checked his call log. The number? It belonged to a woman buried in that cemetery since 1982. Story 4. The reflection that moved on its own. Sarah placed the antique mirror carefully against her bedroom wall. It was beautifully eerie, with delicate carvings and a warped, almost rippling surface. That night, as she brushed her hair, something felt wrong. She turned her head, and her reflection lagged. Her stomach twisted. Maybe she was imagining things? The next night, she tested it. She raised her hand. Her reflection smiled a second too late. Terror coiled inside her chest. That was not her. By the third night, she was afraid to look, but she had to know. She moved, and her reflection kept going. A cold giggle echoed from behind the glass. The mirror shattered. Behind it, she found something worse. A faded photograph of a woman who looked exactly like her. The date on the back. 1897. Story 5. The man at the foot of the bed. For months, Tom had seen him. A shadow standing at the foot of his bed. Motionless. Watching. It started as sleep paralysis. At least, that's what he told himself. Then, his wife saw him. One night, her terrified scream jolted him awake. There's a man," she sobbed, pointing. Tom turned, and he saw it. A man with empty eye sockets, his mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. The figure tilted its head, as if, amused. They moved out the next day. But every night, Tom dreams of the empty-eyed man standing at the foot of someone else's bed. Emma shouldn't have taken the porcelain doll from her grandmother's attic. It was old, cracked, with lifeless blue eyes that almost seemed to follow her. Leave it alone, her grandmother warned. It doesn't belong with us. But Emma loved strange things. She tucked it into her suitcase and brought it home. That night, she woke up to a whisper, soft, sinister. Her breath hitched. The doll was no longer in her suitcase. It was sitting on her nightstand, facing her. Another whisper, "Let me out." Emma's chest tightened. She couldn't breathe. The doll's lips had moved. She threw it away the next morning. But later that evening, her phone rang. It was her grandmother. "Emma, why did you leave that doll here?" she asked, voice trembling. "It's been staring at me all day." Story 7. The midnight visitor Jason was home alone when he heard 3 knocks on his bedroom window. He frowned. That didn't make sense. His bedroom was on the 2nd floor. His stomach twisted. Slowly, he turned his head. A handprint smeared the glass. From the outside, Jason's breath hitched. The shape of the hand was wrong. The fingers too long, too thin that he barely slept that night. The next morning, he stepped outside. His blood ran cold. Beneath his window was a single, wet footprint. Facing toward the house, someone or something had been watching him. Story 8. The house that calls your name. Mike knew the house had a history. Every previous tenant had moved out within a year. He ignored the warnings. He should have listened. The whispers started at exactly 3:00 a.m. Mike, soft, almost gentle, coming from the hallway. The first few nights, he convinced himself it was his imagination. Then, one night, he heard it again. But this time, it wasn't whispering from the hallway. It was calling him from the basement in his own voice. The basement door was locked from the outside. Something was trying to get out. Mike didn't sleep. He didn't pack. He just left. Story 9. The vanishing hiker Lucy and her friends loved camping. The deeper into the woods, the better. One night, as they sat around the fire, a man wandered into their campsite. His clothes were years out of date, like he had stepped out of another time. His eyes held a sadness that made Lucy's stomach twist. He spoke softly. "Don't go near the water." Then, he simply walked away. Confused but exhausted, they ignored him and went to sleep. The next morning, they found his face on a missing persons board at the ranger station. His name? Jacob Wells. Missing since 1987. Story 10. The girl in the fog. Ryan had been driving for hours. Thick fog swallowed the road, making the world feel smaller. Then, he saw her. A little girl standing by the roadside. Alone. He pulled over, rolling down his window. "Are you okay?" She didn't answer. She just smiled. Then, she pointed behind him. Ryan turned, his heart hammering. Nothing, just darkness. When he looked back, she was gone. But his back seat was covered in muddy footprints. The next day, he learned the truth. A little girl had disappeared on that stretch of road. Exactly 10 years ago.